She was sold for the sin of her face and the sound of her tongue, chained to a post in the center of town until a man who had already buried his heart bought her freedom for $10 silver. The place was called Redemption Gulch, a name thick with an irony as bitter as the Nevada dust that coated every surface. It was late autumn in the year 1872, and the sun bled a weak, watery orange across the hard-packed earth, offering no warmth against the wind that bit at exposed skin. The man selling her was Jedediah Kane, a creature of avarice and opportunity, his voice a greasy sermon extolling the virtues of his merchandise. He gestured to the woman, My Leon, as if she were a side of beef. Her hands were bound to a splintered hitching post, her traditional silk tunic, once vibrant, now torn and stained with the grime of a long and terrible journey. She did not cry or plead, her gaze was fixed on a point beyond the leering faces of the miners and trappers, a mask of profound stillness her only shield. In that crowd stood Elias Thorne. He was a man carved from the unforgiving landscape itself, tall and gaunt, with eyes the color of a winter sky that held the ghosts of a war and a wife long since given to the earth. He had come to town for salt and flour, not for human chattel. His 2 children, 10-year-old Samuel and 6-year-old Lily, waited in the wagon, their small faces peeking around the canvas flap, their eyes wide with a confusion that mirrored their father's silent disgust. Kane's voice slithered through the air. Guaranteed obedient. Knows how to cook, how to clean. A real exotic flower for some lucky man. $10. Who'll give me $10 for this China doll? A wave of cruel laughter rippled through the men. Elias felt a cold fury settle in his gut, a feeling he hadn't known since the fields of Shiloh. It was the same hollow sickness he felt when seeing a good horse beaten or a field of corn left to rot. It was the offense of waste, of cruelty for its own sake. He didn't think. He acted. His voice, unused to public pronouncements, was a low, gravelly sound that cut through the noise. I'll take her. The crowd turned, surprise silencing their jeers. Jedediah Kane's eyes narrowed, sniffing out a profit. Well now, the quiet man speaks. $10 it is. Thorne. Elias stepped forward, his movements deliberate. He didn't look at My Leon. He looked at Kane, his gaze so devoid of emotion it was more unnerving than any open threat. He pulled a worn leather pouch from his coat, counted out 10 heavy silver dollars, and dropped them one by one into Kane's outstretched palm. The clink of each coin was a sharp, final sound in the sudden quiet. Kane pocketed the money with a smirk. She's all yours. Got a bill of sale right here. Elias ignored the offered paper. He walked to the post and, with a small knife he used for whittling, sawed through the thick rope binding Mai's wrists. He didn't touch her skin. The rope fell away, leaving raw, red marks. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod towards his wagon. Come, he said, the single word a command, yet absent of the cruelty she had come to expect. My Leon flinched but then rose, her legs unsteady. She followed him through the parting crowd, her head held high, her dignity a threadbare but intact cloak. When they reached the wagon, Samuel stared, his face a small, stoic copy of his father's, while Lily ducked behind a sack of flour, her eyes peeking out. Elias helped Mai onto the back of the wagon, his hand briefly touching her elbow, a contact so impersonal it felt like moving a piece of lumber. He said nothing more as he took the reins, steering the horses away from the gaping maw of Redemption Gulch and towards the vast, silent emptiness of the plains. The journey back to his homestead was a study in silence, broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the sigh of the wind whispering secrets across the sagebrush. The homestead was nestled in a high valley, a solitary outpost against the Wyoming wilderness. A cabin of hewn logs stood firm against the wind, a plume of smoke rising from its stone chimney like a lonely prayer. Beside it, a sturdy barn and the skeletal remains of a summer garden spoke of a life of relentless toil. The entire place seemed to be holding its breath, caught in the grip of the same profound sorrow that shadowed its owner. They arrived as twilight painted the mountains in hues of purple and deep indigo. Elias brought the wagon to a halt, the silence now deeper, more resonant. He dismounted and turned to My Leon. This is my land, he said, the word simple, a statement of fact, not a possession over her. Inside the cabin, the air was warm with the smell of pine and leftover stew. It was sparse but meticulously clean. A single large room served as kitchen, dining hall, and living space. A heavy curtain partitioned off a sleeping area for the children, and a ladder led to a small loft. Elias pointed to a small, windowless room at the back, originally a pantry. A simple cot with a clean wool blanket was inside. "You will be safe here," he said. He placed a bowl of stew and a tin cup of water on a small crate beside the cot. He did not look at her, did not wait for thanks, but turned and left, pulling the door almost closed, leaving a sliver of light for comfort. For 2 days, a quiet routine established itself. Elias and Samuel worked outside from dawn until dusk, mending fences and chopping wood for the coming snows. Lily stayed indoors, watching Mai with a fearful curiosity. Mai, for her part, remained in her small room, emerging only when Elias left food by the door. She ate, and she waited. She had been bought and sold so many times she no longer knew what to expect, but the absence of violence was a language she was slowly learning to understand. On the third morning, Elias approached her as she stood in the doorway, staring out at the snow-dusted peaks. In his hands, he held a small bundle wrapped in canvas. He held it out to her. Inside was a loaf of bread, a piece of dried meat, a full water skin, and the same $10 silver he had paid for her. His eyes met hers for the first time, and she saw in them not the gaze of an owner, but of a fellow prisoner. "The next town is that way," he said, his voice low, pointing east across the valley. "It is 2 days' walk. You are freed." Mai Lian stared at the bundle, at the money that represented her own price. Freedom. It was a word she hadn't dared to think. She looked at the vast, formidable wilderness, a place of wolves and winter, a place that would surely kill her. Then she looked back at Elias Thorne, at the deep lines of grief etched around his mouth, at his 2 motherless children who moved like little ghosts in his orbit. She saw the carefully mended patch on his son's jacket, the way his daughter's hair was braided with a clumsy, fatherly hand. She saw a home, broken but standing. She saw a man not looking for a servant, but a man so hollowed by loss he could not bear to see another creature suffer. In that moment, a different kind of survival instinct took root. She pushed the bundle gently back towards him. Her voice, when it came, was a quiet tremor, rusty from disuse but clear in the crisp morning air. "There is nowhere to go." He stood silent, his jaw tight. "I can work," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "I can cook. I can mend. I can stay." She paused, gathering all the courage she had left in the world, and spoke the words that would change everything. "Can I stay? As your wife?" The question fell into the vast silence between them, a desperate, impossible gamble. Elias looked stunned, as if she had struck him. The wind howled, carrying the scent of snow, and for a long moment, the only sound was the frantic beating of 2 broken hearts. Elias Thorne felt the world tilt on its axis. Wife. The word was a phantom limb, an ache for something he had amputated from his soul alongside his Sarah. He looked at Mai Lian, at the desperate hope in her dark eyes, and a wave of profound weariness washed over him. "I cannot be a husband to you," he said, the words tasting like ash. "The man you would marry is buried on that hill." He gestured with his chin towards a small, fenced-off plot where a simple wooden cross stood against the sky. "My heart is buried with him." Mai's gaze followed his, and a flicker of understanding passed through her. She was not asking for love or passion. She was asking for sanctuary. She was trading one form of servitude for another, but this one, she sensed, came with the possibility of dignity. "I do not ask for your heart," she replied softly, her English careful and deliberate. "I ask for a roof. For a name. I can be a wife in this house. A mother to your children. I will earn my place." The word "a mother" struck him. He looked over at Lily, who was watching them from the cabin doorway, her thumb in her mouth. He saw the loneliness in her eyes, a mirror of his own. He thought of the long, brutal winter ahead. His agreement was not a surrender, but a pragmatic concession to a world that had left them all wanting. "You may stay," he said, his voice flat. "You can help with the chores until the spring thaw. Then, you will still be free to go." It was not an acceptance of her offer, but a postponement. A fragile truce was declared. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet, careful rhythm. Mai moved through the cabin with a silent efficiency that was both remarkable and heartbreaking. She transformed their meager rations of beans and salted pork into savory, nourishing meals. She took the children's worn clothes and, with a needle and thread she had guarded as her only possession, mended them with stitches so fine they were like whispers of care. She did not intrude. She observed, and she filled the spaces left empty by grief. Her first true overture was to the garden. It had been Sarah's pride, and since her death, Elias could not bring himself to touch it. He had let the frost claim the last of the beans on the vine. Mai went out one afternoon, her hands wrapped in rags against the cold, and began the painstaking work of clearing the dead stalks and turning the frozen soil. Elias watched her from the barn, a knot tightening in his chest. She was tending the ghost of his wife, and he didn't know if it was a kindness or a desecration. The children were the barometers of this new climate. Lily, naturally open, was the first to thaw. One day, she found a single, resilient bluebell that had survived the frost and shyly presented it to Mai. Mai's face broke into the first genuine smile Elias had seen. She took the flower and gently tucked it behind Lily's ear, her fingers lingering for a moment in the girl's hair. It was a simple, maternal gesture that made Elias's breath catch. Samuel was harder. He was his father's son, a guardian of his mother's memory. He watched Mai with a silent, judging suspicion. But he was also a boy who noticed things. He noticed the cabin was warmer, cleaner. He noticed his father's shoulders seemed a little less slumped at the end of the day. One evening, Mai found the dress. It was Sarah's favorite, a simple calico frock she had worn to the town social. A tear near the hem had rendered it unwearable in her last days, and Elias had kept it packed away in a chest. Mai laid it out on the table, the worn fabric a map of a life. With her own thread, she began to mend the tear, not just closing the gap, but embroidering over it a small, delicate plum blossom, a symbol of her own distant home. It was not an erasure, but an addition. A joining of two broken things to make a new whole. When Elias came in from the cold that night, he saw the dress. He saw the blossom. He stopped, his gaze fixed on her work. He said nothing, but Mai saw the muscles in his jaw work, saw the glistening in his eyes before he turned away. In the silence of that shared glance, something shifted. The arrangement was no longer about spring. It was about surviving the winter, together. Spring arrived not as a gentle awakening, but as a violent, muddy thaw. The snow receded, leaving the earth raw and vulnerable, and the wind that swept down from the mountains carried the scent of wet soil and new life. The fragile piece of the homestead felt different now, imbued with a quiet hope. Mai's garden was sprouting with the seeds Elias had bought her on his last trip to town, corn and beans alongside bok choy and snow peas. Samuel had begun to talk to her, asking her the names of the strange new vegetables. Lily now followed her everywhere, a small, devoted shadow. The house was filled not with laughter, but with a low hum of contentment that Elias hadn't realized he'd been missing like air. He found himself watching Mai, not as an arrangement, but as a woman. He watched the grace in her hands as she kneaded dough, the concentration on her face as she helped Lily sound out words from an old primer. He had started calling her by her name, Mai Lien, and the sound of it in the cabin no longer felt foreign. But the world beyond their valley had not forgotten them. Jedediah Kane had spent the winter stewing over his $10 sale. Rumors had trickled back to Redemption Gulch of the Thorn homestead, of the quiet man and the Chinese woman who was not a drudge but a partner, making his life orderly and comfortable. Greed, a venomous and patient snake, coiled in Kane's heart. He saw not a family, but an asset he had undervalued. One bright April afternoon, he rode into the valley, two hired thugs flanking him. They stopped at the edge of Elias's property, their presence a stain on the landscape. Elias was splitting logs, the rhythmic thud of the axe the only sound. He saw them and slowly lowered his axe, his body going still. Mai, who was hanging laundry, saw the men and her face went pale. She gathered Lily into her arms and hurried Samuel inside the cabin, her movement swift and silent. Kane dismounted, a swagger in his step. "Thorn," he called out, his voice slick with false bonhomie. Just came to check on my investment. The lease is up. I'm here to collect my property. Elias walked towards him, his steps measured. He stopped a dozen feet away, the axe held loosely in his hand. There was no lease, he said, his voice a low rumble. It was a sale. She is a free woman, Cain laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. A free woman? Don't be a fool. I've got the bill of sale. She belongs to me. Now step aside before my boys get impatient. He gestured to his men, who dismounted, their hands resting on the pistols at their hips. At that moment, as if summoned by the rising tension, the sky began to curdle. Dark, bruised clouds rolled in from the west, swallowing the sun. The wind picked up, whipping through the valley with a sudden, mournful howl. A confrontation was brewing in the heavens and on the earth. Elias looked from Cain to the cabin, where he knew Mai and his children were watching. The protector in him, dormant for so long, awoke with a cold, clear fury. He took a step forward, planting himself directly between Cain and the cabin door. She is not property, he said, his voice ringing with a conviction that startled even himself. She is my wife. He had said it. The word was no longer a negotiation or a convenience. It was a shield. A declaration of war. Cain's face twisted in rage. Get him, he snarled. As his men drew their weapons, the sky broke open. A clap of thunder cracked like a whip, and rain began to fall in thick, angry sheets. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of wind, water, and violence. Elias moved with the lethal economy he had learned in the war. He was not a brawler, he was a soldier. He used the axe handle to deflect the first man's clumsy pistol whip, striking him hard across the jaw. The second man lunged, and Elias met him with a brutal efficiency, disarming him and sending him sprawling into the mud. Cain, coward that he was, pulled his own gun, but his hands were slick with rain. Elias closed the distance in 2 strides, his fist connecting with Cain's face with a sickening crunch. The fight was short, punishing, and decisive. As the storm raged, Elias stood over the 3 men, his chest heaving. He did not kill them. He hauled Cain to his feet, his eyes burning with a cold fire. This land is ours, he growled, the words torn from him by the wind. Do not return. He shoved Cain towards his horse, and the 3 men scrambled to mount, fleeing back into the storm-lashed wilderness from which they came. The rain began to soften, the thunder rolling away into the distance, washing the valley clean. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the world dripping and reborn. The air was cool and clean, smelling of rain-soaked earth and pine. Elias stood alone in the mud-churned yard, his knuckles raw and bleeding, his breathing slowly returning to normal. The violence had purged something from him, a final exorcism of the passivity that grief had imposed. The cabin door creaked open. Mai Lian emerged, her face a canvas of fear and relief. She held a bucket of clean water and a strip of linen. Without a word, she walked to him and gently took his bruised hand, leading him to the porch steps. She knelt before him and began to clean the dirt and blood from his knuckles, her touch as tender as the new leaves on the aspen trees. In her silent care, there was a gratitude more profound than any words could convey. The battle had not just been for her freedom, but for their shared existence. The word he had spoken, wife, hung in the air between them, no longer a question or a contract, but a truth forged in the heart of the storm. Lily and Samuel ran out then, their fear replaced by a fierce, childish pride. Lily threw her arms around Elias's waist, burying her face in his damp shirt. Samuel, ever his father's son, simply stood beside him, placing a small, steadying hand on his arm. Mai looked up from her work, her eyes meeting Elias's, and she shifted, her free arm wrapping around the children, pulling them into a circle that included him. In that moment, under the clean, washed sky, they were no longer for separate, broken souls, but a family. Later that evening, as the last of the sunlight painted the wet landscape in strokes of gold, they finally spoke of the past. They sat at the table, the cabin filled with the warm glow of the lantern. It was Elias who began, his voice quiet but steady. He told her about Sarah, about her laughter that used to fill the cabin, about her love for the garden. He spoke of their stillborn son, a grief so sharp it had stolen his voice and shuttered his heart. He explained how the silence and the sorrow had become his only companions until she arrived. When he finished, the silence was not empty, but full of understanding. Then, Mai Lian shared her own story. She spoke of a small village in Guangdong province, of a family pushed to desperation by famine. She told him of the promise of a good life in America, a position as a governess for a wealthy family. She described the treacherous voyage, the lies of the middleman who took her family's money, and the horror of realizing she had been sold not into service, but into slavery. They were two survivors of two different wars, one fought on a battlefield with cannons, the other in the quiet, brutal backrooms of human greed. Their wounds were different, but their scars spoke the same language of loss and resilience. An epilogue was written not in words, but in the seasons that followed. A year later, the homestead was thriving. Mai's garden flourished, a beautiful, practical fusion of worlds, with rows of corn and beans growing alongside crisp bok choy. The extension Elias had been building was finished, a new room with a wide window that let in the morning light. Inside, Samuel sat beside Mai, patiently teaching her to read from the family Bible, while she, in turn, told him and Lily tales of dragons and clever monkeys from a land they would never see. One warm summer evening, Elias stood with Mai on the porch, watching the children chase fireflies in the twilight. He reached out and placed his hand over hers where it rested on the railing. It was a simple gesture, an acknowledgement of everything that had been built between them, word by word, action by action. He was no longer a man haunted by ghosts, and she was no longer a woman defined by her price. They were home. If this story of two broken souls finding shelter in one another stirred your heart, and if you believe that family is not always the one you are born into, but the one you build with courage and kindness, then we ask you to become part of our community. These are the stories we aim to tell, tales of redemption, resilience, and the enduring power of the human spirit to heal. Please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story that reminds us that even in the harshest wilderness, hope can take root and blossom. Join us, and let's continue to celebrate the quiet moments that change the world.